One
All right. Hey, what's up, guys? This is Allen.
This is Derick.
And today we're going to talk about one of our favorite topics, evolutionary psychology and human behavior.
Evolutionary psychology explains a wide range of human behaviors, from why beautiful people have more daughters, our innate fear of heights, and why women don't really want you for your money.
From dating to selecting music choices and picking out your favorite clothes in the morning, understanding evolutionary psychology will change your life. Alright guys, so whenever I first bring up evolutionary psychology, the first thing that I want to distinguish between is what versus why. And the best way to articulate that is to look at the differences between evolutionary biology and anatomy. So what is anatomy? It would be saying things like, I have 5 fingers, or I have eyebrows, or I have this muscle and that muscle. It's anatomy. It's what? It's what's going on. And that is different than why. So why do I have 5 fingers? Why do I have eyebrows? Why do I have that certain muscle and not another muscle? Why did Australopithecus have larger cheekbones and now Homo sapien does not? Well, evolutionary biology explains why. And that's why I like to first do a caveat on the differences between evolutionary biology and anatomy to give the example of the differences between evolutionary psychology and other fields of psychology. So in the same way that evolutionary biology often answers the question of why do I have 5 fingers? Why do I have an opposable thumb? It's because it served an evolved biological mechanism in the past for our ancestors that made them more likely to face the pressures of natural selection or sexual selection, okay? So evolutionary psychology says the exact same thing. And when Charles Darwin came up with the theory of biological evolution, he actually thought that it would be applicable in psychology, but for some reason, psychology hasn't picked that up until the last 20 years. So why is that? I'm not sure. But evolved psychological mechanisms compared to evolved biological mechanisms, that's the best way to describe the difference between biology and psychology, okay? So whenever I'm thinking about that, that's the best way that I like to describe the differences between what versus why. So what would an example of that be in evolutionary psychology? Okay, it would be this. I would start it with this. Have you ever been standing at a height and looked down, and then gone down to the ground and looked at that same height from the ground and look up at the point you were just at? And I'll ask you a really interesting subjective experience that all humans, and I would guess all other animals, share. It's that things look higher from above than they do from below. And that's describing the what. A lot of psychology could explain what's going on there, but I think it's fascinating that evolutionary psychology explains why. Why is it that while objectively 30 feet is 30 feet, but if I'm looking down from 30 feet, it looks higher than when I'm looking up at 30 feet? Why is that? Well, evolutionary psychology gives us the answer. And in the same way that there are evolved biological mechanisms, such as the opposable thumb, an evolved biological mechanism solved some sort of niche adaptive problem in the ancestral environment that increased our ancestors' chances of facing natural selection, so surviving, or sexual selection, so reproducing. So an evolved psychological mechanism is like that in that it served to solve an adaptive problem in our ancestral environment, but instead of being physical and biological, it's a psychological problem. So to articulate that, I'll use the example of heights. When you're standing next to heights, what is the off chance problem that you might always face? It's that you might fall and die. So that gives evolution a chance to give you a solution to that problem that our ancestors faced. And the solution that our ancestors selected for was perceiving heights as higher to increase cautiousness. So it's really interesting because there's all these biological mechanisms that everyone's very aware of, but there's all these psychological mechanisms that are in the background controlling our lives, and we don't even know they're there. And that's what we're talking about today, evolved psychological mechanisms in evolutionary psychology, okay? So another example of that would be inborn fear of snakes and spiders. So how would you prove that that's inborn and not socially conditioned? Because one of the number one arguments against evolutionary psychology is social conditioning. So when you see people doing certain behaviors, you could say, well, that's because their parents taught them that, that's because society taught them that, that's because they saw it in a movie, yeah. Okay, so what kind of experiment could you do to prove that it's not social conditioning? Well, some really clever scientists came up with this idea. What they did was they took a newborn baby that was only a week old, so there's no way it has any social conditioning. It hasn't learned anything from its parents to the complex ways that we're about to show. And the experiment was set up like this. For a tenth of a second, it showed it a flash of a spider, a flash of a snake, and a flash of an electrical outlet. And I'll get to why they used an electrical outlet. When they showed it the spider and the snake, it triggered amygdala response in the baby's brain. And that just means that it triggers fear because the amygdala is the fear center of the brain, okay? When they showed it the electrical outlet, nothing happened. Now, why is that interesting? The reason is this. You are far more likely in the modern world to die from an electrical outlet than you are to die from snakes or spiders. So how does that show the prevalence of evolutionary psychology? It shows that we have an inborn fear of snakes and spiders that is beyond social conditioning. So this pretty much shows that evolutionary psychology hypothesizes that humans are not blank slates. We are not born with no preconceived notions. And there's a large array of many things you could talk about, but this is just a really easy one for me to wrap my head around. And that's why when I was first learning evolutionary psychology, I liked the heights one, and I also liked the snakes and spider thing, because it made a lot of intuitive sense to me. Okay, so that just shows that we're not inborn, that we don't start out inborn with a blank slate, but we actually start with certain evolved psychological mechanisms like fear of snake and spiders. And why? Because our ancestors faced a high likelihood of being killed by, you got it, snakes and spiders. So while it is way more likely to die from outlets in the modern world, modern humans have not faced the adaptive pressure of dying from electrical outlets long enough to have evolved psychological mechanism to prevent dying from that way. But snakes and spiders have been around for a long time, so our ancestors have had a very long time to adapt to that, as well as the heights problem. So I hope that explains and clarifies some easy to understand mechanisms that you see in evolutionary psychology, because there is a complex amount of other really strange ones, like why men slut shame, why humans tend to have jealousy, and those are more complex, and we can get into those another time. But the last thing that I would say before I hand it off to Derick is just to I really challenge you to try to figure out the difference between evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology, because it is easy to blur those things. When I first started, I was always like, what do you mean? That's just evolution. That's not psychological, like the heights. But when you think of an opposable thumb, that's something that you can touch. I can feel it. So it's biological. If you're ever wondering the difference between the two, the question I always ask myself is, when it's psychological, it's normally something that's only in the mind. It's subjective. It's not an objective thing. It's not objectively true that heights are higher from above than from below, even though it looks higher when you're looking down. So it's subjective. It's psychological. And that's why it's so interesting to understand evolutionary psychology, because it's always pulling the strings. It's pulling the strings from behind, and it's dictating a lot of our behaviors in ways that I never would have expected. And from learning this stuff, it's given me an edge on how to make sure I can get what I want out of my life and not get blocked by psychological mechanisms that I have in my head. So now I'll pass it off to Derick.
Okay guys, so Allen just explained what evolutionary psychology was, and he got into some basic examples of exactly the difference between evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology to give you a basic understanding of what's going on. However, it's important to remember that evolution literally shapes every single behavior that you do, and also shapes the way that we look, the way that we are. Everything about us is shaped by evolution. Now, when I say that word evolution, people have this concept in their heads. A lot of them think of natural selection, which is more or less survival of the fittest. right? Thinking about what traits have you evolved that allow you to survive. And these traits are oftentimes a little bit more obvious. One of them, I'll give an example, is the fact that humans in general like the taste of salt, fat, and sugar. Now, why is that? It's very obvious. It's because those foods are calorically dense. And so humans in the past who liked those foods would oftentimes have enough caloric surplus to last when famines came. And humans that didn't like those calorically dense foods would starve to death during famines and quite literally would get jettisoned from the genetic pool, right? Those genes are no longer around. And another example would be our ability to run extreme distances in the hot sun. Think about ultra marathon runners who can run 200 plus miles straight without taking a break. No other animal can do that. And the reason that we have evolved that capacity is, again, because of survival. That is the way we used to hunt on the safari, on the savannah. And basically we would chase down wildebeests. They would run faster than us initially, but they wouldn't have the same mechanisms of sweating and body temperature regulation that they would essentially die from a heart attack or have to rest, and then we'd be able to come up and just essentially stab them with a spear or whatever, and then we would have food. So that is natural selection. However, the other side to evolution, and some would argue is more powerful, is more fundamental than natural selection, is what we call sexual selection. And because basically evolution doesn't care if you survive or not. Evolution does care that you survive insofar that during your existence, during your time on Earth, you reproduce and you pass those genes on to the next generation. The evolutionary force is not being applied to the individual. The evolutionary force is being applied to the gene. Evolution cares about the gene getting to the next generation, right? And Richard Dawkins wrote a whole book on this. It's called The Selfish Gene. I'm not going to get too into this at the time, but that's an awesome resource to check out if you're more interested in that. But sexual selection, to get back to the point, is basically this pressure from evolution for reproduction. And the traits that come out of that are a little bit more idiosyncratic and what we typically think of when we think of what makes a human different from other animals. You know, our ability to like and create music, to create poetry, our inclination to be attracted to people who are witty and clever. We like comedy, right? We like thinking about abstract concepts. We use all of this brain power for things that aren't directly related to survival. How does doing calculus help you in persistence hunting or foraging for berries? It doesn't help you at all. And in fact, it actually hurts you, because the reason we have those capacities as a human is because our brain is so complex. It's so much bigger, right? And that is actually a handicap because it uses more calories. So if you're strictly trying to survive, that's actually working against you. And you can just look at, rhesus monkeys in Africa. They have survived for just as long as humans. However, they don't have all the skills that I just mentioned. It's because it's not necessary for survival. It was something that was sexually selected, and that pressure sculpted us into that way. However, it's important to remember as well that every single species on Earth has undergone those same exact sexual selection and natural selection pressures. So think about, the peacock. They have this huge tail that again makes no sense in a survival sense. In fact, it's evolutionarily disadvantageous when you look at it from a natural selection point of view. It hurts them in every way to be carrying around this massive tail, this tail that takes so much energy to produce and to carry around. But it's because it increases their chances of reproduction. And that is why it has existed. And that's why it makes them unique in their own way. So humans oftentimes put ourselves on a pedestal because we're unique in so many ways. But when you start to look at other species, you learn that yes, we're unique, but we're not unique in being unique. With all that being said, the concepts that we're saying are pretty interesting. However, you're probably thinking, how can this apply to me? How does this affect my life in any way? And that brings me to something called evolutionary mismatch. Because I remember first learning about this, you have a lot of lights go off. Once you start to understand the true nature of who you are, once I understood exactly what the strings behind the curtains were being pulled, and exactly our history and where we came from, and why we are the way that we are, you can start to understand what environment is going to best suit you. I understood that I need to have certain things in my life that I am evolved to need to have. And so, we live in a civilization, we live in cities, and we've lived in civilization for the past 10,000 years or so. Evolution hasn't had time to catch up to the environment that us humans are living in currently. And so there's a lot of mismatch going on between what we're evolutionarily designed for and the environment that we're living in currently. It would be like putting a polar bear into the middle of Africa. How would that fare? Or putting a penguin into the middle of the Sahara Desert, right? So that's the exact same concept. And once you understand how you were shaped and exactly your behavior, you can start to create an environment for yourself that truly nurtures who you are to the core. And you can start to design your life in a way where you can ultimately flourish. And so that's the point of the video, and that's the point of learning evolutionary psychology. And obviously, we're going to make some videos in the future on what exactly all the evolutionary mismatches that we know of are, so that you can start to design your life in a way that's in accordance with evolution instead of fighting against it. Some of the basic ideas that differentiate biological psychology and psychological biology. Now, those things may sound convoluted, it's because they are.
What did you just say, dude? What did you say? I literally don't know, dude, when you said that. I was like, what? And then you pulled it together, and it actually was like 2 words.